Welcome to the Canadian housing market update for April 2022. I know it's May already, but we don't have the stats on all the different markets in Canada quite yet, so I'm still using the most recent stats that have been released by CREA, which is the Canadian Real Estate Association, which is basically using the stats from March. We are starting to get some of the stats for April, so I will have another video once that becomes available in a week or two. But for now, we're going to be basically doing the April update using the March stats. So we'll start off looking at Canada as a whole with some of the national statistics. Then we'll look at some of the benchmark prices by province. Then I'm going to move into individual cities and regions all across Canada. Hopefully I hit everywhere that people want to see. If I miss something, let me know in the comments. It's definitely hard to figure out which cities to include, but I think I've got a good bunch for you guys here. And if you want to use the chapters, if you look below the video, you can look at the chapters and you can actually click forward to whatever cities or regions that you're interested in. So let's jump right into the video. Starting off with some national statistics. You can see that the headline here from CREA is that March home sales and new listings ease back following a surge in February. So basically what they're saying is the market has slowed down a little bit. The sales volume across Canada dropped, and same thing with the new listings. So if we just look down here a little bit, here's some of the highlights. So the national home sales fell back by 5.4% on a month-over-month basis in March. So it just means it's a little bit less than in February. Actual monthly activity came in 16.3% below the all-time sales record that was set in March 2021. So we hit records last year in March, and it's definitely a pretty significant change, having 16% less sales volume. The number of newly listed properties was down 5.5% month over month, and for the MLS home price index, that rose 1% month over month and was up 27.1% year over year. So we still had a 1% gain across Canada from last month, and a huge gain of just over 27% from last year. If you've been paying attention at all, you know the markets have been quite hot all across Canada. Definitely varies by city. Some places have been hot for a long time, whereas other places, like my local market in Edmonton, have only been hot for the last year or so. So if we keep going here, the national average sales price posted an 11.2% year-over-year gain in March, so we're still up pretty significantly for average prices. If we just look at some of the graphs that they've got here, this is showing the sales activity by quarter. So you can see that we just finished the first quarter of 2022. If we compare that to the quarter one of 2021, that's a pretty significant change. We had over 750,000 sales at that point, and now we're 675 or something around there for all of Canada. Now, if you look at the new listings, you can see that has dropped a little bit, and this one's interesting. So if we're looking at the months of inventory, the months of inventory is the blue bars. The months of inventory is just showing you how many months of inventory we'd have at our current rate of sales. If we had no new listings on the market, how quickly everything would sell. So you can see that basically shortly after the pandemic, we started having a lot less inventory. So that's been dropping steadily since then, but it did pick up a little bit in March. We had a little bit more inventory than we did in February. And the sales to new listing ratio, that's basically looking at how many sales are happening versus the number of new listings. And that really started to spike after and during the pandemic. And then we had a bit of a drop again, and it did spike recently, but now it's dropped again as well. So we're still well above where we've been in previous years in 2017, 2018, 2019, but it is still a significant change from what we were seeing recently. So we'll see if this is going to be a new trend or if it's just what's been happening this last month. Now, if we look at the residential prices in Canada, you can see it's been steadily going up for the most part since 2005. This is showing the average price versus the MLS home price index, essentially. So you can see that they both are following the same sort of trajectory in Canada. Now, this is where you can really see that not all markets are the same. Like, yes, we're talking about a Canadian housing market update right now, but you can't apply just blanket statements about all of Canada without setting yourself up to make mistakes or wrong assumptions. This is just showing you by province the year-over-year price change. And you can see there's a big difference depending on where you are. So Canada as a whole was over 10%. You can see in BC it was right around 15%. Alberta, you know, that might be like 7.5%, and Saskatchewan's down there, the lowest one for March. Manitoba had pretty nice gains, and Ontario as well, and as Quebec. And then New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island had really big increases. And then Newfoundland and Labrador also had a decent increase as well. So everywhere across Canada is up, but you've got a pretty big swing depending on where you are. And this is just showing the home price, benchmark price, and how it kind of varies depending on what it is. So obviously a 2-story home is going to be more expensive. Then the next thing is kind of the 1-story, and the townhouses are not too far apart, and apartments are obviously the cheapest. I did want to point out at this chart, I showed a similar one, but this is basically showing monthly home sales in Canada, but as well as a 10-year monthly moving average. So you can see that even though the home sales have dropped from some of the peaks in Canada, they're still well above the 10-year average. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the market's going to crash or something like that, even though it's slowed down. Time will tell, obviously. We've got to watch and see what happens. Interest rates have been going up quite a bit. I do think that's a big factor that's been affecting the Canadian market as a whole, regardless of what market you're in. Obviously, when interest rates go up, it gets more expensive for home buyers and borrowers to get a mortgage, and that does start to affect the demand. So I do think that's one of the key factors that is cooling down the market a little bit, but don't get me wrong, it's still very hot in many and most markets across Canada. And as you can see, we are still above the 10-year moving average in terms of sales volume. So we'll be keeping an eye on that to see if it dips below that, then it's starting to be a little bit of a different story. That's some of the overall highlights I wanted to give you for the Canadian market as a whole. Okay, so it looks like the CREA website is having an issue with their national price map. So I guess I won't be able to show you that in this update, but you can go check this out on their website. Just search CREA price map or national price map, and you can find this, and you can basically click and see how different provinces' benchmark prices have changed from last year. So now I'm going to get into the individual markets. Again, if you look at the chapters along the bottom of this video, you can jump to whatever markets you're interested in, or just tune into the whole thing to get a good overall picture on what's going on in different markets across Canada. I just want to remind you, if you're getting value out of this video, it helps me a lot if you hit that like button and subscribe. I'm trying to get to 500 subscribers. I'm sitting around 460 or something like that right now, so I'm getting pretty close to that goal. If you could help me out, that'd be appreciated. Let's jump into the rest of the video here. So the first market we're going to look at is Toronto. If we're looking at Toronto, you can see that the average Greater Toronto area home price hovers at 1.3 million. That sure sounds like a lot coming from Edmonton in my local market. There was almost 11,000 homes sold in March 2022, which was the third best March and the second best first quarter on record, saying tight market conditions continued to support a double-digit annual pace of price growth with an average selling price of 1.3 million. If we look at some of the graphs here, you can see that we're still above the 10-year average for sales activity. So even though it has slowed from last year in terms of sales volume, it's still above the 10-year average. So that's still a lot of activity. If we look at the number of new listings, that also dropped from last year, but that's also still above the 10-year average. So it's still a very active market, as anybody knows that is out in Toronto. And if you look at the number of active listings, we're still well below the 10-year average. So there's still a bit of a lack of listings in the Toronto area at the end of March. Now it'll be really interesting to see what it looks like in the April stats. I have a feeling it might have slowed down a little bit more. And if we look at the months of inventory, this is how many months until basically all the inventory is sold. The 10-year average is just above 1.5 months of inventory, which as an Edmontonian, that sounds pretty insane, because for us, a 1.5 months of inventory is quite hot, but that's just the 10-year average in Toronto. But we're still sitting quite a bit below that with less than 1 month of inventory, even though it has crept up from 2021. It's not quite as crazy as it was last year in March in the Greater Toronto area. If you're looking for a great realtor in the Toronto area, you can head over to booktrevornow.com and we can hop on a call and I can set you up with a good agent in your local market here in Toronto. Okay, next we're going to look at the Vancouver area. And you can see that the headline is that it's calmer than last spring's record pace, but Metro Vancouver homebuyer demand remains elevated. So even though it's down from last year, it's still elevated. So there was 4,344 sales in March 2022, which is a 23.9% decrease from the 5,708 sales recorded in March 2021, and a 26.9% increase from the 3,424 homes sold in February 2022. A few increases and a few decreases there. If you look at the 10-year average, you can see that even though there's a decrease from last year, we're still above the 10-year average for sales activity in Vancouver. And if we look at number of new listings, even though that also dropped from last year, it's still above the 10-year average. And yeah, there's just a note here that March 2021 was the highest selling month in history, essentially, and that last month's sales were still 25.5% above the 10-year average. Now, if we look over at the number of active listings, it's actually still down from last year, and for the last 3 years, we've been below the 10-year average in the Vancouver area. And this just kind of shows you the residential average prices since January 2013. Had a pretty big run up, going from around 700,000 to pretty close to 1.3 million, 1,350,000. So that's a pretty big increase over time. Definitely have not seen something like that in Edmonton. And yeah, they just mentioned that they're still seeing upward pressure on prices. The lack of supply is obviously driving that pressure. If you're looking for an agent recommendation in Vancouver, we can hop on a call and I can make sure to connect you with a good agent in the Vancouver area. Just go to Book Trevor Now and select a time on my calendar, and then I'll give you a call. Next up is Calgary. So if we're looking at Calgary, they've got record high sales again in March. For the second month in a row, sales activity not only reached a monthly high, but also hit new record highs for any given month. Gains occurred across every property type as they all hit new record heights. So there was an increase in new listings this month. The inventory still remained low, which has definitely made it more of a seller's market in Calgary. They're saying that just even though supply levels have improved from what we had over the last 4 months, inventory levels are still well below what we traditionally see in March, since there's been stronger than expected sales activity. And they've got just over 1 month of supply of homes in the market. And so that's very tight market conditions for Calgary. The benchmark price was sitting at $518,600 for the month. So prices have risen almost nearly $55,000 since December, and they're currently sitting at 18% higher than last year's levels. Take a look at the 10-year average on what's going on for March. So you can see that we're well above the 10-year average, but it was only last year in 2021 and then now in 2022 that we've been above that 10-year average in Calgary. The last time that happened was in 2014, so levels were significantly lower than that for quite a while. So this is quite a hot market for Calgary. Now, if you look at the new listings, so even though there's a lot more sales happening, there's also more listings happening than average for the last 10 years. And we had even more new listings here in March 2022 than we did last year. Number of active listings, and this is where you see that the inventory levels have been below the 10-year average for the last 2 years in March. And it went lower from last year as well. So that's part of what contributes to it being a hot market and seeing those prices go up in Calgary. Now, months of inventory, this is where you see a very stark change. So that the 10-year average is a little like 3.5, just below 4 months of inventory. That's what goes on in Calgary. It's pretty similar in Edmonton. I think ours are over 4 for our 10-year average, but dropping below 2 last year. It got really hot in Calgary, and now still sitting at around 1 month of inventory. We really do have a supply problem, and that definitely contributes to it being a hot market and being really tough out there for buyers. Now, if you look at the average price trend for Calgary, this is going back to January 2013, you can see that it's not quite like what we saw in Vancouver, where it just kind of goes from the left up and to the right. There's more ups and downs, and it's a little bit more flat, and it obviously has been booming more recently. So if you're looking for a great Calgary realtor, I can hook you up with a good recommendation. We can hop on a call and I can chat with you about what you're looking for, whether you're looking to buy or sell, and make sure that you get set up with a good agent that's local to the Calgary market. Just go to booktrevornow.com and you can select the time on my calendar, and we can go from there. Now we're looking at my home market. This is still using the March stats, even though the April stats are now available in Edmonton. We'll just do a quick overview of this one. Since I've got a lot of other videos on my channel that are specific to Edmonton, we'll just sort of quickly look at some of the 10-year histories here in Edmonton. You can see that for our sales volume, we were up significantly in March compared to last year, but last year was a good year for us as well. Both years have been well over the 10-year average, so it's definitely hot in Edmonton. If you look at the new listings, that's also up over the 10-year average. That helps a little bit because we need some more inventory. Now, if we look at the number of active listings, we did end up with less active listings than what we had last March. In March 2021, we were pretty much right at that 10-year average, and now we dropped down lower, which has contributed to March being hotter this year than it was last year. And then you can also just see our months of inventory really dropped. So like I said, we were a little over 4 months on our 10-year average, which is a little bit higher than Calgary. And our inventory levels are a little bit higher than Calgary's, but they've definitely dropped a lot. And last year in the spring was pretty hot, and it's been hotter this year so far. So at least with March, right? Kind of similar to Calgary, you can see looking at the average prices since 2013, like there have been some gains, but there's been some ups and downs. So depending on when people bought in Edmonton, they may or may not be in a better selling position. So for a lot of homeowners in Edmonton, the price gains that we've been seeing in the last few months have been a very welcome news. Obviously, if you're looking to buy a house, it's never fun when you see prices going up, but if you were already in the market, a lot of people were happy to see prices going up here in Edmonton recently. And as you may or may not know, I am a realtor in Edmonton, so if you're looking to buy or sell a home in Edmonton, make sure to reach out to me directly. I can give you a lot more specific advice rather than just sort of this overall view of what's been going on. You can reach me on my cell at 780-819-5508. You can either text me or call me, or you can email me at trevor@trevortardif.com, or go to booktrevornow.com, select the time on my calendar, and then I will call you. I'll make sure to ask you lots of questions and find out kind of what you're looking for and give you some strategic advice based on your unique circumstances. So make sure to reach out. Next up, we're gonna look at Ottawa, but if you're enjoying this video, make sure to like and subscribe. I'm trying to get to 500 subscribers, and curious if these types of videos covering the market across Canada is interesting to you guys. If so, let me know in the market. Let me know in the market. Let me know in the comments. Okay, so looking at Ottawa, well, the March resales indicate strong spring market. They sold just over 2,000 properties in March, compared with 2,274 in March 2021. So it's a decrease of about 12% from last year. So even though the number of sales decreased from last year, it was still robust and busy start to the spring season. That's definitely one thing to remember in a lot of these markets. Even though we're seeing drops in some markets in terms of sales volume, that doesn't mean that they're not still a robust market. Just because you might have peaked in terms of sales volume doesn't mean that you necessarily even peaked in terms of prices yet. You might not be accelerating as quickly, but it's still possible for prices to go higher, even if you're not quite as hot as you were before. So you can see the transactions increased 42% over February, and they're still 12% higher than the 5-year average. So this is just looking at the sales volume. You can see it's been over the 10-year average for the last couple of years in Ottawa, even though it's dropped a little bit from last year. New listings are a little bit below the 10-year average now, so that's probably contributing a little bit to it being hot. And you can see the number of active listings. It's basically just kind of kept dropping since 2016. Inventory got really tight, and there's just a slight uptick at the end of March compared to March 2021. So definitely pretty low on the active listings, and you can see that with the months of inventory as well. It has popped up a little bit, but the market's been quite hot for quite a few years here, being below that 10-year average. Might be welcome news that it appears to have gone up slightly if you're in the market to buy in Ottawa. Okay, so let's look at Winnipeg now. So in Winnipeg, there was 1,436 sales in March. So it's an increase of 11% over the 5-year average. It's the second best March on record, but not as big as last year's March. So they've got less new listings this year compared to last year. Yeah, so it's still quite hot, but not quite as hot as last year in Winnipeg. You can see that the sales volume really spiked last year, well below the 10-year average, and it's still above that now. Now, if we look at the number of new listings, that did drop this year, even though it was a little bit elevated last year in March compared to the 10-year average. And then looking at the number of active listings, the inventory levels have continued to drop from 2021 levels to 2022 levels, and that's kept the months of inventory quite low in Winnipeg, sitting at less than 1 month of inventory when the 10-year average is just below 3. So definitely more of a seller's market than it has been in quite a while. And this just shows you the average price trend over time, worked its way up over time. And that's sort of the highlights for Winnipeg. Okay, now if we're looking over at Hamilton in the Burlington area, there was 1,636 sales in that area in March, and the sales were up 33.3% from February, but down 21.1% compared to March 2021. So we're seeing a pretty across the board in most cases where sales volume actually dropped in this March compared to last March. That's not the case in every market, but in a lot of them it is. Some of these markets in Canada may have peaked in terms of their sales volume. There was also 2,542 new listings in March, which is up 51.7% month over month, but it's actually a slight decrease from March 2021. So if we look at that, you can see that the sales activity is still elevated, even though it's dropped. It's still above the 10-year average, so it's still a hot market in terms of sales activity. And same thing with the new listings, those are also elevated. So that still shows you it's a hot market. And same thing with the active listings, with the number of active listings being lower, that also contributes to it being a tighter market as well. Pretty similar in Hamilton in 2021 to 2022 in March at least. And then with the months of inventory, you can see those are also quite low as well. Even though the 10-year average is also pretty low, it's significantly lower right now, which is part of what's made it a very hot and tight market. And this is just showing the average prices going up and to the right, of course, since January 2013. Next up is the Kitchener-Waterloo area, Kitchener-Waterloo Association of Realtors. So the home sales were up in March, but the average price dips from February. Interesting. So there were 725 homes sold through the MLS system in March 2022, which is a decrease of 27.1% compared to March 2021, which was the record last year by the looks of it. If we look at the sales activity, yeah, so it's still above the 10-year average, but last year's March just shot up way above it. Now, if you look at the new listings, again, those also dropped, but they're still elevated. So just because you might have hit the peak in number of sales and new listings doesn't necessarily mean that it's the peak of the whole market. Yeah, and they're just making a note that the prices essentially skyrocketed the last 2 months, and they took a bit of a breather in March, and that it's too soon to draw conclusions from just 1 month of home sales, and just seeing that average price sort of level off a little bit was welcome news to some. So yeah, this is one of the first markets we've looked at where the average price actually dropped in the month of March, and we'll have to see kind of what happens when we go and get the April stats out there. It's still a big increase from last year though. So it's sitting at 960,000, which is 25.5% increase over March 2021. But even though it's a 4.6% decrease compared to February. So definitely can be the beginning of a shift. Interest rates have gone up. We've also got a whole nother month of data after this one that we'll have here pretty soon in my next national update video. But it's interesting to see that kind of shift in Kitchener. Okay, now we're looking at London and St. Thomas. There was 1,049 homes sold in March in the area, and there was 1,544 new listings. That was a record number of listings. Inventory looks like it's still low. It's creeping up from 0.5 months to 0.6 months of supply, so that's a pretty tight market. And the sales to new listing ratio for the entire area was 67.9%. which is much lower than a year ago, but still indicating a seller's market. So it's still pretty hot out there, even though not quite as hot. And then they're mentioning the interest rates, and the average price was sitting at $823,954. Now, if we just look at some of those 10-year average charts, you can see that even though it's dropped, it's still above the 10-year average for number of sales. The Number of new listings is still elevated as well. I think that they might have said it was a record number of new listings. And if you look at the number of active listings, even though it came up a little bit, it's still significantly below the 10-year average there. And the months of inventory is still very low, less than half of the 10-year average. And you can see the average prices here going up and to the right. Looks like it might have went down just slightly that month. But yeah, it's still a pretty hot market at the end of March there in London. Okay, so now we're looking at the Niagara Association of Realtors. So that includes like Niagara and St. Catharines and that sort of area around there. So the number of homes that sold through the MLS in that area was 942 in March, which was a decline of 20.6% from March 2021. They were 17.7% above the 5-year average and 27.5% above the 10-year average. Even though, again, same thing, even though they've dropped, they're still elevated. Now, if we look at the number of new listings, those also dropped, but they're still elevated as well. And the number of active listings, they actually still dropped a little bit in this March and are still much lower than the 10-year average. And the months of inventory, even though that did creep up a little bit, and that's because the sales volume dropped, it's still quite low compared to the 10-year average, which makes it still a pretty hot market. And you can just see that the average price has gone up and to the right over time, and it had a slight dip this month for the average price. Even though it dipped a bit this month, it was 850,800, which is 32.3% year-over-year increase. So even though it's a bit down from last month, it's still up a lot from last year. Okay, now we're looking at the Windsor and Essex County Association of Realtors stats. They're just saying the home sales set new record for the month of March. So the number of homes sold through the system totaled 812 in March 2022. That was a small gain for March 2021, 12 sales, more than March 2021, so very similar to last year. And it was also a new sales record for the month of March. Sales were 26 above the 5-year average and 38.9% above the 10-year average for the month of March. So still significantly elevated sales volume. And obviously it just went up a little bit, but it was pretty similar to last year. Now, if you look at the number of active listings, it did rise a bit, but it's still low. And same thing with the months of inventory. Those are quite low as well and well below the 10-year average. And then the average prices, again, you can see them kind of going up and to the right. We got over 700,000. And again, if you're looking for a realtor in one of your local markets across Canada, I can set you up with a great agent recommendation. You can just go over to booktrevornow.com, select the time on my calendar. We can hop on a call and I can find out who would be the best agent for you. Okay, looking at the Durham region. So this is basically in the, I'm probably gonna say it wrong, the Oshawa. Near there's several regions that are part of the Durham region. For that whole area, there was, let's see, they don't say the number of sales, but the home prices dipped slightly, but the sales are still strong. There was 1,390 sales last month, which was down significantly from the crazy March 2021 numbers, but it is still above the 10-year average. So there was 53% more new listings in March, but there was still a bit of a drop in terms of the number of new listings compared to last year, but it is still elevated from a 10-year perspective. And the average price did drop 6.5% from last month, and it still remains the lowest amongst the GTA regions. They're just straight out saying there's a shift happening and we expect to see further corrections still, but nothing overly substantial. So interesting language they're using there. Listings are up and so are the amount of sales, which is great to see for so many buyers. You can see that the listings did drop a little bit and the active listings have crept up a little bit because they're getting a little bit closer to the 10-year average in terms of active listings. And the months of inventory, there was a significant increase from March of last year, but we are still below the 10-year average. And it looks like the association there is expecting to see some more minor corrections, so we'll have to see. Okay, hopping over to the Victoria Real Estate Board, and so they're saying it continues to experience low inventory and high demand. And there was a total of 833 properties sold in March, which is 29% fewer than the 1,173 that were sold in March 2021, but a 16% increase from February. We talked about condos. They've had a record breaker of a month. You can see that, yeah, even though the sales volume is down, so that's clearly not where they broke the record in their sales volume. The lowest number of active listings we've seen in a month of March. So that's what makes it real hot. You can see it's well below the 10-year average for the number of active listings on the market, even from last year. And the number of new listings actually dropped a little bit from last year and is below the 10-year average. And that contributes to it being a hot market. Yeah, and if you look at the months of inventory, it's even though it's slightly crept up from last March, it's still well below the average, so it is a tight market. And this is just showing you the history from January 2013 and the average price up until now. Okay, so let's look at New Brunswick. In all of New Brunswick, there was 1,064 sales in March, which is just a moderate decrease of 7.9% from March 2021. So you can see it's still elevated. The number of new listings has dropped a little bit, and it's actually managed to drop below the 10-year average. And you can see the number of active listings has still been trending down, and that the months of inventory has also been quite low as well. They must calculate, yeah, their months of inventory, so their 10-year average is much higher than what you see in a lot of other markets, but it's still way lower than their average right now. So that definitely contributes. You can see that their market's a little bit flatter in New Brunswick than a lot of these other markets, but they have seen some big gains over the last couple years here. Now, if we just look at a little bit more specifically some of the areas of New Brunswick, basically you could just see that the average price in Fredericton was $350,655. In Greater Moncton, somebody please correct me. The average price in there is $364,270. In the northern region, you got just over $202,000. In St. John, the average price was $306,419, and then for the whole of New Brunswick, it's $315,888. Okay, now let's take a look at Nova Scotia as well. So there was 1,203 sales in March, which is a pretty big decline in sales volume from March 2021, but they're still above the historical norms for this time of year, and that's just what they're showing here. So even though it's not as hot as last year in terms of sales volume, it's still high. They're just showing that the benchmark price was $390,000 in March 2022, which is a significant increase of 37.4% compared to March 2021. So definitely didn't see numbers like that in Edmonton. You can see the number of new listings is also down in Nova Scotia, and the number of active listings has been steadily dropping basically since 2016. And so it's quite below the average, the 10-year average. And then the months of inventory is also quite low compared to their 10-year average in Nova Scotia. And you can see again a similar sort of story as some of the other markets that got a big run up in prices essentially since the pandemic. I'm sure the quantitative easing and low interest rates all helped with that. Here's some the number of sales, which is interesting. A lot less sales in most of the markets in Nova Scotia than last year, but the average prices are still up a lot compared to last year. 25%, 20%, 24%. Halifax, yeah, 24.9%. So some pretty big increases in prices. Okay, now looking at Newfoundland and Labrador, the last market we're going to be looking at here in the Canadian housing market update for April. So they're saying that home sales surpassed the Q1 2021, and the new listings return a historical average for this time of year. So there was 443 units sold in March, and that's down modestly by 2.9% from March 2021. Home sales were up 35.7% above the 5-year average and 47.4% above the 10-year average. So even though it's down a little bit from last year in terms of sales volume, it's still well above average. And the number of new listings has dropped a little bit and getting closer to that 10-year average. The number of active listings is still significantly below the 10-year average. And the months of inventory is also quite a bit lower as well. You can see this market, their months of inventory, even now, they're sitting at over 5 months of inventory. I'm assuming they calculate it the same way that we do in other markets, but that just shows you how much different some markets could be, because having 5 months of inventory in a market like Edmonton is closer to a balanced market, but you can see that's well below the 10-year average in Newfoundland. This just looks at the residential average price. This is probably the only one that I've seen that looks like this. So they had definitely some drops since 2013, and they probably had some welcome gains starting in 2020. but they're still below some of the highs that they look like they might have had in 2014 and whatnot. So I'm sure some homeowners out there have enjoyed the market conditions that have made prices go up a little bit. And I just remembered that that is not actually the last of them. I do still have Montreal and Quebec. I had to go to a different source here since they're not on the Canadian Real Estate Association website. So just looking at March sales, I do actually have access to the April ones, but it wouldn't be apples to apples if I was comparing the April ones. But you can see that in the Montreal Metro, there in March 2022, there was 5,493 sales, whereas in 2021, there was 6,281 sales. So there's been a 13% drop in sales volume. So we're seeing that in a lot of markets across Canada. Number of active listings went from 10,423. It went down to 10,423 compared to last year's 11,607. So 10% less active listings than we had last year in March. And the number of new listings in March 2022 was 7,217. Whereas in 2021, it was 7,925. So that's also down 9%. Now, if I do some quick math here, just to look, I know they calculate their months of inventory a little bit differently, but if I just use it at the current rate that they've been selling in March, at number of active listings, there was 10,423, and I divide that by number of sales, 5,493. That's 1.89 months of inventory. So that's, I would consider that pretty tight as well. Maybe not quite as tight as some of the other markets, but that still contributes to it being a seller's market. Now, if we go and look at, so Quebec City in March 2022, there was 1,120 sales, whereas in March 2021, there was 1,326. So that's a 16% drop in sales volume. And the number of active listings was 2,406, whereas last year was 3,487. So 31% decrease in number of active listings. So even though the sales volumes dropped, there's still a lot less active listings. And the number of new listings sitting at 1,305, whereas last year there was 1,572 in March. So the sale of the number of new listings has dropped as well. So that's interesting that the sales volumes dropped. We're still significantly lower active listings, but the number of new listings is not keeping pace of what it did last year. So if that sort of thing continued over time, that could make the market more balanced. Let me see, let me do a months of inventory calculation here. So yeah, so this has 2.14 months of inventory in Quebec City. So not quite as tight as Montreal, but I'd still consider that seller's market for sure. That pretty much finishes it up for the Canadian housing market update in April. I will have another one of these here probably in a week or two after I've got, or Korea has all of the information for all the different boards using the April stats. Let me know what you guys think about this format. This is the first video that I did looking at Canada as a whole. I hope you got value out of this video, and you can let me know in the comments and by liking and subscribing to let me know that you want more videos like this, or if you hate it, let me know. If you got any tips, that would be greatly appreciated. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. You can subscribe with this button over here, and if you check out this playlist over here, you can watch more videos as well. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.